December 9th, 1945. 11:47 p.m. A military staff car crawls down a frozen road outside Mannheim, Germany. Inside, General George S. Patton stares through the frost-cracked window at the ruins of a nation he helped destroy. 12 days later, he will be dead. Not from a bullet. Not from a bomb. Not from the 1,000 ways war tried to kill him across 30 years of combat. He will die because a truck turned left. And when Douglas MacArthur receives the telegram 3,000 miles away in Tokyo, he will say something so brutal, so shockingly honest, that the officers who heard it never forgot it for the rest of their lives. This is the story they never put in the newspapers. December 21st, 1945. 9:30 a.m. Tokyo time. MacArthur's office on the 6th floor of the Daiichi Insurance Building sits in silence, so complete you could hear a man's heartbeat. Outside, the windows occupied Japan moves through its mourning under American authority. Inside, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Pacific sits completely still, holding a telegram, and the expression on his face is something his staff have never seen before. Douglas MacArthur, the man who did not flinch at Pearl Harbor, who refused to surrender Patton, who waded ashore at Leyte Gulf with cameras rolling and history watching, looks like something has cracked open inside him. He dismisses everyone, asks to be alone. And for the next several minutes, in absolute silence, America's most powerful general stares at 6 words on a piece of paper. General George S. Patton, Jr. is dead. To understand why those words hit MacArthur like artillery fire, you have to understand what the world looked like in the autumn of 1945. The most destructive war in human history had just ended 4 months earlier. Hitler was ashes. The Empire of Japan had surrendered on the deck of the USS Missouri. 60 million people were dead across 6 continents, and the 2 men who had arguably done more than any other American generals to win that war, Douglas MacArthur and George S. Patton, were both still alive, both restless, both utterly lost in the silence that follows the last gunshot. MacArthur was 65 years old, ruling Japan like a shogun, managing reconstruction directives and occupation politics instead of commanding assaults. Patton was 60, stripped of his beloved Third Army Command, after making reckless political statements, reassigned to write a history of the war he had just finished fighting. 2 titans reduced to administrators. 2 men built entirely for one purpose, now living in a world that no longer needed that purpose. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born in 1885 on a California ranch into a family that treated war like a religion. His grandfather died fighting for the Confederacy. His uncles told him stories of Gettysburg like other families told fairy tales. By the time young George was old enough to read, he was already obsessing over Caesar's campaigns, Napoleon's tactics, the cavalry charges of ancient empires. He didn't want to be a soldier. He wanted to be a warrior king. There is a difference, and that difference would define everything. Soldiers follow orders. Warrior kings reshape history with their bare hands. He entered West Point in 1904 and nearly failed out his first year because mathematics refused to cooperate with a mind built for chaos and momentum. He repeated. He survived. He graduated not at the top like MacArthur did, but with something more dangerous than academic brilliance. He graduated with absolute unshakable certainty that he was born for one thing and one thing only: to destroy the enemies of his country on an open battlefield while moving fast. Always forward, never stop, never look back. His first taste of real combat came in 1916 when he rode with Pershing into Mexico chasing Pancho Villa. He killed 3 of Villa's men in a single ambush, threw their bodies on the hood of his car like hunting trophies, and drove back to camp grinning. His commanding officers were simultaneously horrified and fascinated. This man was not normal. This man was something older than the modern military, something feral, something that belonged in a different century entirely. Then came World War I. Then came tanks. And George Patton looked at those mechanical beasts lumbering across French mud and understood something that almost nobody else understood yet. These machines were not just weapons. They were the future of war, They were speed. They were shock. They were the cavalry charge of the 20th century. And if you used them right, used them with aggression and boldness, an absolute refusal to slow down, you could break an enemy army, not by grinding it to death, but by cutting through its heart so fast it didn't know it was dead until it fell over. He commanded tank units in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He got shot in the leg. He kept commanding from a shell crater while his men fought around him. He was 33 years old and already a legend. Between the wars, Patton festered. The peacetime army shrank. Budgets collapsed. Politicians who had never held a rifle decided what soldiers needed and didn't need. Patton spent the 1920s and 1930s riding horses, writing tactical manuals. Nobody read, and waiting. Just waiting. Because he knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had looked at the map of Europe and understood human nature completely, that another war was coming. And when it came, he intended to be ready. He was more than ready. November 8, 1942. Operation Torch. American forces land in North Africa and immediately walk into a catastrophe. The GIs of 1942 are not yet the soldiers they will become. They are brave, but green enthusiastic but untested. And when German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's veteran Africa Corps hits them at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the result is brutal. American forces collapse. They retreat 30 miles in 2 days. They lose over 10,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Rommel is so contemptuous, he barely bothers to pursue. Back in Berlin, German generals laugh. American soldiers, they say, cannot fight. Into that disaster walks one man with ivory-handled pistols, a riding crop, and a voice like a cannon. George Patton takes command of the 2nd Corps on March 6, 1943. What he finds is a demoralized, disorganized, defeated army. What he leaves behind 2 months later is something completely different. He revokes privileges. He demands standards. He screams at officers in front of their men. He fires incompetence on the spot. He drives forward through every obstacle his own supply chain puts in front of him. Within 6 weeks, the same soldiers who ran from Rommel at Kasserine are running toward German positions at El Gueter, and for the first time in the North African campaign, American infantry is stopping a German armored counterattack dead in its tracks. Rommel calls it unexpected. His officers call it alarming. The word coming out of the desert is that the Americans have found someone who fights like a German. No, not like a German. Like something older than that. Like a Mongol. Like a Roman. Like something that has no concept of stopping. Then, Sicily. Summer 1943. Patton and British General Bernard Montgomery are given joint command of the invasion, and within days, Patton has turned a military campaign into a race. He doesn't care about the objective. He wants Messina. He wants to beat Monty to the northern coast, and he pushes his men so hard that war correspondents can barely keep up. 38 days. The entire island falls in 38 days. Critics in Washington call it reckless. Patton calls it beautiful. His soldiers, half dead from exhaustion and heat and combat, call him something that cannot be repeated in polite company, but they say it with a grin because they know they are watching something extraordinary. And then comes the incident that almost ends everything. August 3, 1943. Patton is visiting a field hospital in Sicily. He walks through rows of wounded men, stopping at each bed, talking to soldiers with bandaged stumps, where arms used to be, with faces rearranged by shrapnel, with the hollow eyes of men who have seen things that cannot be unseen. He is doing well. He is holding it together. And then he reaches a man who has no visible wounds. Private Charles Cool sitting on a box, shaking. Patton asks him what's wrong. The soldier says his nerves. He can't take it anymore. And something in Patton snaps. He slaps the man. Hard. Across the face. He does it again a week later to another soldier. And when Eisenhower finds out, the entire Allied command structure goes into crisis mode. Newspapers get the story. Washington explodes. Patton nearly loses everything. He doesn't. Eisenhower needs him too badly. But the punishment is profound. While his fellow generals are planning the Normandy invasion, Patton sits in Sicily doing nothing. While history is being made on the beaches of France, George Patton, the most aggressive combat commander America has produced in a generation, is driving around England, pretending to command a fictional army group designed to fool German intelligence. The humiliation is total. The waste is almost criminal, and the man responsible for it cannot stop himself from being exactly what he is. Because that is the truth MacArthur will one day say out loud in a Tokyo office, the truth that will shock his officers into silence. You cannot separate George Patton from his wars. You cannot take the battlefield away from him and expect him to survive. It would be like taking the ocean away from a shark and expecting it to walk on land. The biology is wrong. The architecture is wrong. Some men are built for one environment and one environment only, and when you remove them from it, they don't adapt. They die. Slowly or quickly, they die. But that realization is still 2 years away. In August 1943, George Patton is sitting in Sicily furious and humiliated while his peers make history without him. He doesn't know yet that his greatest moment is still coming. He doesn't know about a frozen road in Belgium, a surrounded airborne division, an impossible maneuver that military textbooks will argue about for decades. He doesn't know that he will pivot an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours and save 10,000 men from annihilation. He doesn't know any of that yet. He just knows he is being left behind. And for a man like George Patton, that is worse than any wound. In Part 2, we will see what happens when Eisenhower finally unleashes him on the European continent, what Patton does with that freedom, and why the very qualities that make him unstoppable in war make him impossible in peace. In Part 1, we watched George Patton transform broken American forces in North Africa into a fighting machine that stunned Rommel's veterans. We saw him race across Sicily in 38 days, and we saw him nearly lose everything because he couldn't stop himself from being exactly what he was. A warrior who had no setting between full throttle and destruction. He sat in Sicily humiliated, grounded, while the greatest invasion in human history was being planned without him. But here is what nobody told you. The men planning that invasion were terrified, not of Patton, of what would happen if they didn't use him. Because by the spring of 1944, Allied casualty projections for the Normandy landings were catastrophic. And somewhere in the back of every senior commander's mind was one uncomfortable question. Can we afford to leave Patton on the bench? The answer, as it turned out, was absolutely not. By January 1944, Allied planners in London were staring at numbers that made grown men go pale. German defenses along the French coastline had been under construction for 3 years. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain. Concrete bunkers, minefields, artillery positions, steel obstacles in the surf designed to shred landing craft and the men inside them. Intelligence estimates suggested that a standard frontal assault on those beaches could cost 40,000 casualties in the first 72 hours alone. 40,000 men, dead or wounded before a single inland objective was secured. Eisenhower read those projections and made a decision that would have ended a lesser general's career before it began. He picked up the phone and called for Patton. The conversation between Eisenhower and Patton in the spring of 1944 was not warm. These were not friends sitting down over coffee. Eisenhower had defended Patton against calls for his dismissal after the slapping incidents. He had spent political capital protecting a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of staying out of trouble. And now he needed that man to do something deeply strange. He needed Patton to be a ghost. Operation Fortitude was the greatest deception in military history. The plan was simple in concept and nearly impossible in execution. Make the Germans believe that the real Allied invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. And to make them believe it, you needed to give them something convincing. You needed an army group. A real general. Someone the Germans respected enough to build their entire defensive strategy around. Eisenhower looked at his list of available commanders, and the answer was obvious. George Patton was the most feared American general in German intelligence files. Rommel knew his name. Von Rundstedt knew his name. Hitler himself had reportedly said that Patton was the most dangerous man the Allies possessed. So Eisenhower put Patton in command of a fictional army, gave him a headquarters in Kent, let German reconnaissance planes photograph his vehicles and equipment, and waited. Patton hated every second of it. "I am being used as a goddamn scarecrow," he reportedly told his aide Colonel Charles Codman during those weeks of enforced theater. He wasn't fighting a war, he was performing in one. Standing at staged headquarters, making carefully leaked speeches, driving in conspicuous motorcades designed to be spotted by German agents. Every instinct in him screamed to move, to attack, to do something real. Instead, he stood still and let himself be watched. But here is what that sacrifice accomplished. When D-Day came on June 6, 1944, and Allied forces hit the beaches of Normandy, German High Command refused to commit their panzer reserves. Because they were certain, absolutely certain, that Normandy was a feint. That the real invasion led by Patton and his fictional 1st United States Army Group was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler held those armored divisions back for weeks. Weeks in which the beachhead consolidated reinforcements poured in and the breakout became possible. Military historians have argued for decades about how many lives that deception saved. Some estimates run into the hundreds of thousands. The Ghost Army and its most famous ghost delivered a victory without firing a single shot. Then Eisenhower cut him loose. August 1, 1944. Patton takes command of the real Third Army in France. What happens next is so fast, so aggressive, so utterly unlike anything the Wehrmacht had seen from American forces, that German commanders initially refused to believe their own intelligence reports. Third Army does not advance. It erupts. Within 72 hours of activation, Patton's columns are moving so fast that supply trucks cannot keep up. He is outrunning his own logistics, a fact that horrifies his staff and delights him completely. Compared to war, all other forms of human endeavor shrink to insignificance, he wrote in his diary that August. You can hear the joy in those words. You can hear a man who has found his way back home. 400 miles in 30 days. That number sounds impossible, and it was. Standard military doctrine of the era expected an advance of perhaps 5 to 7 miles per day against organized resistance. Patton was doing 15, 20, sometimes 30 miles in a single day. German units that expected to fight a rearguard action found Third Army already behind them, cutting off their retreat. German units that thought they had days to prepare defensive positions found Patton's tanks arriving hours after the first reports. The speed was the weapon. The speed was the entire point. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt later said in a post-war interview that Patton's August offensive of 1944 was the single most alarming development he witnessed on the Western Front. Not the D-Day landings, not the strategic bombing campaign. Patton moving fast through France. That was what kept von Rundstedt awake at night. And then came December. The Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge. December 16, 1944. Hitler gambles everything on one massive counteroffensive through the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. 20 German divisions punch through American lines in a sector considered too rough for major operations. Within 72 hours, the situation is catastrophic. American forces are surrounded, cut off, frozen, running out of ammunition and time. The 101st Airborne Division is trapped in the town of Bastogne, surrounded by German armor, being pounded from every direction. Eisenhower calls an emergency conference. He turns to his assembled generals and asks who can relieve Bastogne and how fast. Most commanders say 3 or 4 days, maybe a week, maybe longer given the weather and the ground conditions and the German armor in the way. Patton has been sitting in the corner with a map saying nothing. He raises his hand. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, he says. The room goes silent. Not because they believe him, because the statement is so insane that nobody knows how to respond. General Omar Bradley reportedly turned to him and said, "Don't be fatuous, George." Pivoting an entire Army Corps 90 degrees in 48 hours in winter against armored opposition across terrain that military textbooks classified as nearly impassable for large formations was not a thing that could be done. Patton smiled and said it was already done. He had ordered his staff to begin planning 3 alternative attack scenarios 3 days earlier before Eisenhower's call, because he had looked at the German offensive and known with the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life studying war exactly where it was going and exactly what would be needed to stop it. December 26, 1944. Third Army's 4th Armored Division crashes through German lines south of Bastogne at 4:45 in the afternoon. The corridor is thin, barely a mile wide, but it is open. Supplies pour in. The 101st Airborne, which had famously responded to a German surrender demand with a single word, "Nuts," survives. The Battle of the Bulge turns. And military historians mark that moment as one of the most remarkable logistical and tactical achievements in the entire history of American arms. MacArthur read about it in Tokyo through military dispatches. He sat with the reports for a long time before setting them down. He and Patton had never spoken about the bulge, never compared notes, never discussed the mechanics of that pivot. But MacArthur understood what it meant at a level deeper than tactics. It meant that Patton had done in 48 hours what most men could not do in a week, not because he was smarter or better resourced or more experienced, but because he had been ready. Because he had already been thinking 3 moves ahead, already planning for the catastrophe before it arrived, already living so completely inside the logic of war that the war itself was almost too slow for him. That was the man MacArthur sat mourning in December 1945. Not a general, a force of nature that had somehow agreed to wear a uniform. And the question that kept circling back, the one MacArthur could not escape as he stared at that telegram, was whether a force of nature could survive its own end. Whether a man built entirely for one world could live in another. The answer was already in front of him. Patton's final months had been a slow unraveling. The Third Reich fell in May 1945. Patton's Third Army was there, racing through Bavaria, crossing the Rhine, capturing territory at a pace that made even his own officers dizzy. And then Germany surrendered. And Patton kept moving. Not on the battlefield, but with his mouth. He compared former Nazi Party members to Democrats and Republicans in a press conference that exploded across the front pages of every newspaper in America. He made statements about the Soviet Union that bordered on demands for a Third World War. He was relieved of Third Army Command in October 1945, reassigned to write a history book. George Patton commanding a library. He lasted 6 weeks in that assignment before the car accident on that quiet road outside Mannheim ended everything. MacArthur understood. He understood because he looked at Patton's final months and saw a man suffocating. The controversial statements, the relief from command, the bitter diary entries, these were not signs of a man going mad. They were signs of a man dying by degrees inside a world that had no use for what he was. A caged animal that cannot stop roaring even when the roaring makes everything worse. MacArthur had more political instinct than Patton, more willingness to navigate the corridors of Washington and manage the men who controlled his fate. But he was not immune to the same disease. He was 65 years old, ruling occupied Japan, and somewhere in the back of his mind, growing louder every week, was a question he could not silence. What happens to men like us when there is no war left to fight? In Part 3, we will see MacArthur get his answer. A new war is coming on a peninsula in Asia. A war MacArthur will walk into with absolute certainty of his own invincibility. And that certainty, the same quality that made him unstoppable in the Pacific, will become the thing that finally breaks him. In Part 1, we watched Patton rebuild shattered American forces in North Africa and race across Sicily like a man possessed. In Part 2, we saw him become a ghost army, then unleash Third Army across France at speeds that broke German comprehension, and finally pivot an entire corps in 48 hours to save 10,000 trapped men at Bastogne. We left MacArthur in Tokyo, holding a telegram asking himself the question that Patton's death had made impossible to ignore. What happens to warriors when the war ends? The answer was coming, faster than MacArthur expected, from a direction nobody anticipated. And when it arrived, it would not look like salvation. It would look like a trap. June 25, 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in the largest military offensive Asia had seen since the Japanese surrender. 100,000 soldiers, Soviet-built T-34 tanks, artillery air support. The South Korean army collapses in 72 hours. Seoul falls in 3 days. United Nations forces, meaning mostly American troops, are rushed in from Japan. They are undertrained, under-equipped, and thrown directly into the path of an army that has been preparing this assault for 2 years. The first American units to make contact with North Korean forces are destroyed almost immediately. Task Force Smith, 640 men, hits the North Korean advance near Osan on July 5th and is simply overwhelmed. 180 casualties in a single afternoon. The survivors run. MacArthur watches all of this from Tokyo and feels something he has not felt since the dark days of 1942. Not fear. MacArthur did not experience fear in the conventional sense. What he feels is purpose. The guns are firing again. The world needs him again. He is 68 years old, and he has never felt more alive. His plan for reversing the Korean catastrophe is audacious to the point of insanity. And that is precisely why it works. Every conventional military mind in Washington looks at the map and sees a peninsula where United Nations forces are being compressed into a tiny perimeter around the port city of Pusan in the far south. The logical response is to reinforce Pusan, hold the perimeter, grind down the North Korean supply lines, and push north when strength allows. Safe. Methodical. The kind of plan that wins wars slowly and costs enormous casualties over enormous time. MacArthur looks at the same map and sees something different. He sees Incheon. Incheon is a port city on the western coast of Korea, 200 miles behind North Korean lines. Landing there would cut every supply line running to the North Korean forces pressing against Pusan. It would trap an entire army between two allied forces. It would end the war in a stroke. Military planners in Washington review the proposal and compile a list of reasons it is impossible. The tides at Incheon are among the most extreme on Earth, rising and falling 32 feet twice daily, leaving mudflats stretching miles from shore that would strand landing craft like beached whales. The seawall inside the harbor would require troops to scale it under fire using ladders. There is no beach. There is almost no window of adequate tidal height. The margin for error is measured in minutes. Joint Chiefs Admiral Forrest Sherman tells MacArthur directly that Incheon has every natural and geographic disadvantage an amphibious landing could possibly face. MacArthur stands up in the briefing room in Tokyo, and what he says next is remembered by every man present for the rest of their lives. He speaks for 45 minutes without notes. He talks about Wolfe scaling the cliffs at Quebec. He talks about the landing at Incheon's very impracticality being its greatest strength, because the enemy knows it is impractical, and therefore has not fortified it adequately. He talks about surprise being a force multiplier that no statistical analysis can fully capture. And then he says, "I can almost hear the ticking of the second hand of destiny. We must act now, or we will have lost our opportunity." The room is silent. Sherman turns to a colleague and says quietly, "I wish I had that man's confidence." September 15th, 1950. Operation Chromite begins at dawn. The first wave hits Wolmido Island at 6:33 a.m., and the island falls in 45 minutes. Marines scale the seawall with ladders exactly as planned. North Korean defenders, who have had 2 days to notice the naval buildup and still cannot quite believe anyone would attempt this, are overwhelmed before they can organize a coherent response. By nightfall, 30,000 UN troops are ashore. By the next morning, the perimeter is secure. Within 2 weeks, Seoul is liberated. Within 3 weeks, North Korean forces that were strangling the Pusan perimeter begin to disintegrate. They are cut off. They are out of ammunition. They are dying by the tens of thousands in a trap that snapped shut so fast they never saw it closing. The numbers are staggering. Before Incheon, UN forces hold a perimeter roughly 50 miles long and 30 miles deep around Pusan. After Incheon, North Korean forces lose an estimated 135,000 men killed, captured, or simply dissolved into the countryside within 30 days. The South Korean capital is restored. The entire strategic situation reverses in less than a month. MacArthur has done it again. He has looked at a map that everyone else read as a death sentence and found inside it a masterpiece. Washington is euphoric. The press calls it military genius. MacArthur's photograph is on the front page of every newspaper in America. President Truman, who has had a complicated relationship with MacArthur since the end of World War II, publicly calls the Incheon landing one of the greatest military operations in history. For a brief moment in the autumn of 1950, Douglas MacArthur is exactly what George Patton was in the summer of 1944. Unstoppable, vindicated, magnificent. And then he walks straight into the same trap that destroyed Patton. Not an accident on a quiet road. Something slower. Something that grows inside a man who has been right so many times that he stops believing he can be wrong. MacArthur drives UN forces north past the 38th parallel. The objective shifts from restoring South Korea to destroying North Korea entirely. His forces advance toward the Yalu River, the border with China. Intelligence reports warn him that Chinese forces are massing on the other side. MacArthur dismisses the reports. He sends a message to Washington that the war will be over by Christmas. His men advance into the mountains of North Korea in late November, spread thin, moving fast, chasing a retreating enemy that is leading them exactly where China wants them. November 25, 1950. 300,000 Chinese soldiers pour across the Yalu River in the dark. They have no air support. They have minimal artillery. They have bugles and grenades and absolute willingness to die in enormous numbers, and they hit UN lines with a force that produces the largest retreat in American military history. The Marines at the chosen reservoir fight their way out of a complete encirclement in temperatures of -30 degrees Fahrenheit, killing an estimated 25,000 Chinese soldiers in one of the most brutal sustained battles of the 20th century, and still retreat 78 miles to the coast. 8,000 American casualties in 2 weeks. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas threatens to consume the entire peninsula. MacArthur responds to this catastrophe not with adjustment, but with escalation. He wants to bomb Chinese bases across the Yalu. He wants to blockade the Chinese coast. He wants nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan introduced into the conflict. He wants, in plain language, to expand the Korean War into a general war with China. Truman says no. The Joint Chiefs say no. NATO allies say absolutely not. MacArthur says it anyway publicly to a Republican congressman whose letter he personally endorses, contradicting the official position of the United States government, while in uniform and in command of American forces in the field. Truman relieves him on April 11, 1951. The manner of that relief is itself a kind of violence. MacArthur learns he has been fired not from the president directly, but from a news bulletin. A staff officer hears it on the radio and rushes to tell him. MacArthur is eating lunch with his wife Jean in Tokyo. He sits quietly for a moment. Then he says, "Jeannie, we're going home at last." His voice is calm. His hands are steady. He is 71 years old, and the uniform he has worn for 52 years has just been taken off him by a president he considers strategically illiterate. The American public explodes. Congress invites MacArthur to address a joint session. He flies home to a ticker-tape parade in New York that draws 7.5 million people, more than the parade for Eisenhower after World War II. He stands before Congress and delivers a speech that ends with words that enter the language permanently. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. He is composed throughout. He does not weep, he does not shout. He simply stands there magnificent and finished, and says goodbye to the only life he has ever known. And in that moment, if you look past the ceremony and the applause and the enormous American appetite for heroic exits, what you see is the same thing MacArthur saw in Patton's death 6 years earlier. A warrior outliving his war. A man built for one world standing in another, too proud to break, too honest to pretend it is the same. MacArthur had understood what happened to Patton. He had said it out loud in that Tokyo office in December 1945. Peace killed him, not war. He had seen it clearly in someone else. He had simply never believed it could happen to him. But Patton died on a quiet road after 12 days of paralysis. MacArthur faded. He lived until 1964, giving speeches, attending ceremonies, watching younger men manage the wars. He believed he would have fought better. He was right that he would have fought them differently. Whether differently meant better is a question history has never fully resolved. What MacArthur could not see, what neither he nor Patton could see, is that the world they were built for did not end because the guns stopped firing. It ended because the guns of the next war were a different kind of gun entirely. Nuclear weapons proxy conflicts, limited wars with unlimited political constraints. The new warfare required not warriors in the ancient sense, but managers of violence, men who could hold power in one hand and restraint in the other simultaneously, who understood that the objective was not annihilation, but negotiation, not total victory, but controlled outcome. MacArthur was constitutionally incapable of that kind of war. Patton would have been worse. They were not obsolete because they were old. They were obsolete because the world changed the rules without asking permission, and some men are simply too precisely formed for one set of rules to adapt to another. In Part 4, we will ask the question that everything has been building toward. What does it mean? What do the lives of these two men, these two warriors who survived everything except peace itself, actually tell us? And why does MacArthur's reaction to Patton's death, those raw private words spoken in a Tokyo office on a December morning, contain something that matters far beyond military history? The answer is not what you expect. And it begins with a question MacArthur whispered to an empty room the night before he left Japan for the last time. We have traveled a long way together. We watched George Patton rebuild a broken army in the North African desert and race across Sicily like a force of nature that human institutions could barely contain. We watched Douglas MacArthur conjure a ghost army from nothing land at Incheon against every rational calculation and reverse a catastrophic war in a single audacious stroke. We watched both men burn so brightly in combat that peace, when it finally came, had nothing left to offer them that was worth having. We left MacArthur in the wreckage of his Korean command, relieved by a president he considered his inferior standing before Congress, to deliver a farewell that 70 years later still echoes. The question we asked at the end of Part 3 was the right one. What does it mean? What do these two lives, these two particular warriors, actually tell us about something larger than themselves? The answer begins with a room in Washington, D.C., and a very old man sitting in it alone. Douglas MacArthur returned to the United States in April 1951 to a reception that bordered on mass hysteria. 7.5 million people lined the streets of New York. Ticker tape fell like snow. Crowds screamed his name with the intensity of people releasing something they had been holding for years, some combination of grief and pride, and the particular American hunger for a hero who refuses to go quietly. MacArthur stood in his open car and accepted it all with the composure of a man who had been expecting exactly this his entire life. He was 71 years old. He had been in uniform for 52 years. He had survived Patton and Incheon and Truman. He had given the speech, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." He had meant it to be poignant. He did not fully understand yet how literally it was about to become true. The Republican Party wanted him for president in 1952. He gave the keynote address at their national convention and delivered a speech so long and so removed from political reality that the delegates visibly lost interest before he finished. Eisenhower won the nomination. MacArthur moved into the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, where he would live for the next 13 years, in a suite on the 37th floor, meeting visitors, writing his memoirs, watching the world change through a window above the city he never truly belonged to. Presidents consulted him occasionally more out of courtesy than genuine interest in his opinions. Journalists came to interview him and wrote respectful profiles that treated him as a monument rather than a man. He attended ceremonies and gave speeches and remained as he had always been, magnificent in appearance and absolute in his convictions. But the phone rang less and less. The wars that followed Korea were fought by different men using different doctrines. Vietnam was building toward catastrophe along lines that MacArthur had specifically warned Kennedy about in 1961, telling the young president that any American who wanted to commit ground troops to a land war in Asia needed to have his head examined. Kennedy listened politely. His successors did not listen at all. MacArthur watched the disaster unfold from his suite at the Waldorf and understood every mistake being made and had absolutely no power to prevent any of them. That is perhaps the most refined form of the warrior's peacetime torment. Not ignorance of what is coming. Perfect knowledge of it combined with complete inability to act. He died on April 5, 1964. He was 84 years old. His last public appearance had been at West Point the previous year, where he delivered an address to cadets that is still read and recited in military academies around the world. Duty, honor, country. He spoke for 30 minutes without notes, and cadets who were 18 years old and had never seen combat stood in silence and felt something they could not name, the weight of a tradition so old and so serious that it made ordinary life feel thin by comparison. It was the best speech he ever gave. It was also his goodbye, and somehow everyone in the room knew it. Patton's story ended 16 years earlier and 11,000 miles away, but its aftermath is no less instructive. He died December 21, 1945, and was buried in Luxembourg at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, alongside the soldiers of Third Army he had commanded. He had specifically requested burial among his men, rather than being returned to the United States for a state funeral, and that request was honored. The grave is still there. Every year, visitors from dozens of countries make the trip to stand beside it, and the numbers have not declined with the decades. They have grown. The man who was nearly fired in 1943 for slapping a soldier is now considered by military historians to be among the half-dozen most consequential combat commanders in American history. The men who wanted him dismissed are footnotes. Patton is a monument. But here is what nobody tells you about Patton's legacy, the part that gets lost in the mythology of ivory-handled pistols and profane speeches. His real contribution to American military doctrine was not his speed or his aggression, or even his tactical brilliance at moments like the Bastogne relief. It was his absolute insistence that soldiers should be treated as the primary instrument of victory, and that their welfare, their training, their morale, and their confidence were not soft considerations to be managed by chaplains and counselors, but hard military variables that determined whether an army fought or ran. He was brutal in his demands and foul in his language, and he expected more from his men than any commander they had ever served under. And they loved him for it, not despite the standards, but because of them. Because high standards meant he believed they could meet them, and men will die for a general who believes they are capable of greatness. The tactical principles Patton refined and proved in World War II, the use of speed to create psychological collapse, rather than simply physical destruction, the understanding that an enemy's will to fight is as important a target as his equipment and personnel. The doctrine of relentless forward pressure that denies the enemy any opportunity to stabilize and reorganize these principles did not retire with the men who carried them. They evolved. They were incorporated into American military doctrine in ways that shaped every subsequent conflict. The operational maneuver that destroyed the Iraqi army in 100 hours during Desert Storm in 1991 was built on foundations that Patton would have recognized immediately. The speed of the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003, whatever its subsequent political failures, was, in its military execution, an almost direct descendant of Third Army's August 1944 offensive through France. Military analysts who have studied the long-term data estimate that Patton's innovations in armored warfare doctrine, particularly his development of combined arms coordination between tanks, infantry, and air support, reduced American casualties in the final year of the European War by a figure some put as high as 30%, compared to what attrition-based tactics would have produced. The exact number is impossible to verify. But the principle is not disputed. He saved lives by winning fast, and the armies that learned from him continued saving lives in every conflict that followed. MacArthur's legacy is more complicated, which is entirely appropriate for a more complicated man. Incheon stands as one of the most brilliantly conceived and executed military operations in history. The occupation of Japan, which he administered from 1945 to 1951, is considered by historians of Asia to be among the most successful post-war reconstructions ever attempted, transforming a destroyed, traumatized nation into a functioning democracy with a modern economy in less than a decade. Those two achievements alone would secure any general's reputation for eternity. The disaster of his march to the Yalu and his subsequent relief are part of the same record, and history holds them together without resolution as it should, because the man who conceived Incheon and the man who ignored intelligence about Chinese intervention were the same man operating from the same core assumption that Douglas MacArthur understood war better than anyone around him, and that those who disagreed were simply wrong. He was right often enough that the assumption was understandable. He was wrong at the worst possible moment in a way that cost thousands of lives. That tension is MacArthur's permanent historical condition, and no amount of mythologizing in either direction resolves it honestly. Now for the detail that most accounts leave out. The thing that connects these two men at a level deeper than military history or strategic analysis. In 1961, Douglas MacArthur gave a long interview to the journalist Jim Lucas that was only partially published at the time. The full transcript sat in an archive for decades. When it was finally reviewed more completely by researchers, it contained a passage about Patton that MacArthur apparently requested be kept off the record during his lifetime. In it, MacArthur said something that recontextualizes everything he said publicly about Patton's death in December 1945. He said that he had been wrong about Patton, not about Patton's greatness as a soldier, which he called beyond argument, but wrong about what Patton's death meant. He had said in that Tokyo office that peace killed Patton, that warriors cannot survive when the guns go silent, that some men are simply built for one world and cannot live in another. He had believed that for 16 years. And then he sat in his suite at the Waldorf, an old man watching the world through a window, and he understood that he had misread it completely. Patton did not die because he was a warrior who could not survive peace. Patton died because he was a man who could not adapt, and those are not the same thing. The inability to adapt is not a warrior's virtue. It is a human limitation. One that MacArthur, despite his intelligence and his political instincts and his genuine historical greatness, shared completely. The real lesson of both these men is not that warriors are tragically incompatible with peace. It is that the qualities that make anyone extraordinary in one context, the absolute certainty, the refusal to accept conventional limits, the willingness to risk everything on a single decisive action, become liabilities the moment the context changes and the person cannot change with it. Patton's certainty that the only real objective was destroying the enemy made him unstoppable in France and impossible in occupied Germany. MacArthur's certainty that he understood Asia better than Washington made him visionary at Incheon and catastrophically blind at the Yalu. The gift and the curse were the same thing. They always are. There is a version of this story that treats Patton and MacArthur as tragic heroes destroyed by a world too small for their greatness. That version is satisfying and wrong. The more honest version is that they were two extraordinary men who each accomplished things that genuinely changed history and who each carried inside themselves a rigidity that eventually overcame their brilliance. Neither of them was destroyed by peace. They were revealed by it. War had given them a context where their particular combination of genius and inflexibility produced victory. Peace removed that context. What remained was still impressive. It was not enough. MacArthur whispered something to an empty room the night before he left Japan for the last time in April 1951. His aide, General Courtney Whitney, heard it from the doorway and recorded it in his memoirs. MacArthur stood at the window looking out over Tokyo in the dark, and he said very quietly, "I was wrong about something." Whitney did not ask what. He understood that some confessions are not meant to be answered. From a farm in California and a frontier post in Arkansas, two boys grew up believing that war was the highest human calling, and that they were born to answer it. They were right about the second part. The calling came multiple times, and they answered it with a totality that most human beings never approach in any field in any lifetime. Between them, they saved hundreds of thousands of lives, shortened a world war, rebuilt a nation, and left a permanent mark on how modern armies think about speed, audacity, and the relationship between military action and political reality. That is not nothing. That is in fact almost everything. The question MacArthur spent his last decade trying to answer, the one he whispered to an empty room over a dark Tokyo that April night, is the same question that Patton never got the chance to ask. Not whether they were great. They were. Not whether they mattered. They did. But whether greatness that cannot bend is truly great, or whether it is simply very powerful in one direction, like a river that carves canyons and cannot cross flat ground. If you have spent the last 90 minutes with these two men, and you are still asking yourself what any of it means for you here, is the only answer worth keeping. The world has always needed people willing to believe that the impossible thing is possible, and to bet everything on that belief. Patton at Bastogne. MacArthur at Incheon. Every person who ever looked at a problem that everyone else had accepted as permanent and refused to accept it. The courage that changes history is almost always the courage that looks from the outside, like recklessness. The question is not whether to have it. The question is whether you also have the wisdom to know when the context has changed, and it is time to become someone slightly different than you have always been. Patton never learned that. MacArthur learned it too late. You have the advantage of knowing their story. Use it while there is still time.